Like usually once we start getting above to those 1400 covers, above that, it's a strong indicator of surplus grass on farms. And even like if you're looking at cover per cow 200, we're talking about surplus grass at that stage as well. But maybe if there are surpluses to be taken out, you could possibly target some of those poorer quality fields over the last few weeks, those to be the ones that are taken out.
This week I'm joined by Padraig McCormack, Dairy Advisor in Moorepark, to discuss the current situation on farms in his area and what things his clients have on their agenda over the next few months. I started by asking Padraig to tell me about the grass situation on the farms in his area.
Look, around here, the grass situation anyway has kind of started to improve. I suppose when we look back this time last month, things were getting dry around here. Growths had really started to drop really since the end of May, I suppose, we're after getting a bit of rain. I think there's looking there earlier, I think there's around 55, 60 mil after falling here in Moorepark. Since then, and so I suppose growths have started to increase, and we're kind of, I see we're kind of back up to the 5 year national average now this week in terms of growths. But looking across this area in groups and stuff, growth kind of this week are around 65 to 70 kilos of dry matter. In the last week among farmers around here. And demand then in the area is kind of around 55 kilos of dry matter, and I suppose a cover per cow then of around 190 to 200 is what we're looking at around here. So I suppose talking to a few farmers today, even now the talk is starting thinking about going to looking at taking out surpluses now over the next week or so. Um, as I said, average demand, look, we're looking at, I think it was 55 kilos dry matter among groups this week and around here. So if we're going to get growths of 70, which is projected across next week, now we'll be kind of looking at adding over 100 to the average farm cover in the next week. So um, some people are starting to look at taking out a few surpluses here and there now as well.
They've been running at the kind of probably a higher cover per cow with the last couple of weeks, maybe on foot of what you said there about the poorer quality and trying and back a month ago and trying to get grass cover back up again, and maybe weather hasn't been kind, I suppose, in terms of surplus in the short term either. So, are you seeing people beginning to think about heading back towards the kind of 180 cover per cow again, having been hovering around the 200 with the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, you can see him really start to drop back now in the last week really is where it's after coming back. I was looking last week, we are up around 200 of cover per cow. I think we're down towards 190 now. So people are starting to go back to that kind of 160 to 180 kind of a cover per cow at the moment. And then I suppose, look, average farm cover, that's gone to around, we're at 600 up 700 in parts. So like it's a rough guide then with pre-grazing, we're kind of going into covers around 13 to 1400, looking at a few wedges over the last week. But I suppose there's a few farms there as well starting to drift above this and heading towards 15, 16, 700, 1700 pre-grazing covers, which it'll start to drop intakes and therefore start to drop milk production as well. So like usually once we start getting above to those 1400 covers, above that, it's a strong indicator of surplus grass on farms, and even like if you're looking at cover per cow 200, we're talking about surplus grass at that stage as well.
Yeah,
But I know over the last few weeks, quality has kind of been an issue on farms. Like I know that the grass plant was starting to look a bit stressed, and I know at time of the year plants are kind of going into the reproductive stage and they're starting to head out. But I think this is kind of starting to be corrected in farms now across the last week. Um, but maybe if there are surpluses to be taken out, you could possibly target some of those poorer quality fields over the last few weeks to be the ones that are taken out.
so the project, what you're saying there is, we'll say some of that, even though the rain came, as you said, that 50, 60 mils that has fallen according to the weather station here, in the last couple of weeks, some of the quality of the grass that has been grazed hasn't been hectic because, as John would have said on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, the plant had decided to head already, and that has kind of carried through. So you have a bit of a mix of quality of grass, but you think that that's kind of just been grazed off now, and people are getting back into more higher quality material again.
Yeah, they're starting to get there. It might take another while to get quality back on track again, like, but it's slowly starting to improve across farms and it I've seen so far. Really. I suppose the thing to be that now, I suppose from now on is just keep walking the farm every 5 days as well. Just keep making, to help you make the right decisions at the right time, I suppose, is what you need to be looking at.
Yeah, so like you said there, again, I suppose when we look at the pasture base updated earlier in the week, they're indicating exactly as you said there, it's very similar numbers, 70 to maybe 75 of a growth and kind of 50-55 of a demand. Now, obviously, if the demand is being kind of tempered by feed, then that has to come out first and let it come up. But it is likely that there is going to be surplus, so that very quickly, I suppose fields could potentially get away. So, like you said, you've probably seen it on with the groups that you're talking about there, that the pre-grazing cover is beginning to creep up. So that's why you're advocating that people will walk regularly now over the next number of weeks to try to keep going into that 14-1500 cover.
Exactly, yeah. No, no, it's just important to try keep going at that 13-1400 of a cover. The farm can move very quick this time of the year, like, so it's just keeping on top of it and just taking paddocks out that need to be taken out if that arises. And I suppose just on a note as well, maybe Stuart, just on off takes as well. If you're taking out surpluses, remember that you're taking off a bit of P and K as well. So it's important maybe if you have a bit of slurry or whatever to target on those fields as well after it gets taken out as surpluses.
So, Padraig, in terms of fertilizer advice, then would say obviously that growth rate is up around the 70s there at the moment. Probably want to keep that there or thereabouts anyway. So, fertilizer regime to maintain that.
From my perspective as an advisor, I suppose being conscious of what fertilizer you have left to spread, first of all, knowing how much of your allowance you have left. Like we were talking about, we're 90 days now from the start of close period, say whatever, 75 days from the start of September. So you need to see how many units you can spread in each rotation or each day over until the start of September. Um, that could be lower depending on what your grassland stocking rate finished up at last year.
So, just explain that, I suppose, Padraig. People that are stocked over 210 have a lower allowance than people that are stocked under the 210. So, I suppose it's people that are stocked over the 210 that'll have to be particularly conscious because they have that maybe is it 20 units less or something to work with.
Yeah, exactly. So like if you've so previous year grassland stocking your rates, so from last year, say if you finished over 210, you're in derogation, you finished over 210 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, you're talking about you've 170 units per acre of an allowance for this year. If we go to a stocking rate then of between 171 and 210, they get 20 units extra, so they're at 190 units an acre. And then I suppose if we look at farms outside of irrigation, maybe stocking rate there of 131 to 170 last year. They're at 148 units per acre. So those people maybe between the 171 and 210, they have a bit more fertilizer to play with possibly, whereas the farms at the other stocking rates have a bit less to play with.
So in general, then what kind of a recommendation? You mentioned the 90 days there. What kind of obviously it depends on what you have left, but
Exactly.
roughly speaking, what are you talking on a per day basis? Would you be recommending in a unit per day basis?
It could be less than that in other cases. If you have a lower allowance, it could be less than the unit per day, really, is what we're looking at, I'd say.
Yeah, so you're probably talking depending on clover contents and so forth, you could get away with less than the unit, but if you don't have clover, you're probably looking at that unit a day type scenario, and people will
Exactly.
have to be fairly careful if they don't have the allowance then that they can maybe use alternatives like slurry and soil water potentially to fill the gap maybe.
Exactly as well. And I suppose on that, when you mentioned clover, like it's a good time now to start putting soil water on some of those. If you have any swards with greater than 20% clover, you could start looking at putting out 1,500, 2,000 gallons per acre of soil water on that ground and replacing some of the nitrogen on fields like that. And also, when I'm on it, I suppose to continue at the moment to use sulphur in your fertilizer. The aim for the year is 15 to 20 units for grazing ground, and then if we're looking at silage ground, you're talking about 15 to 20 units per cut.
Yeah, and what would your experience be of that, Patrick, in terms of like before we used to talk about having it done by the 1st of June, but it's actually quite tricky to actually do it in terms of the actual quantities of sulfur that are in the products now and the rates that they're applied at. So are you seeing kind of people maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of the way there, and they'll be finished by the start of July, maybe with the sulphur element on the grazing areas.
Yeah, I think so. When you are working it out, like I think they are going later to try and get to that 15 to 20 units, like because you're not getting it if you're say to be finished by the 1st of June. I don't think they're meeting that 15 to 20 units really.
Yeah, and I suppose it's important in terms of the reduced nitrogen rate that people do continue that sulfur element, because it'll drive the efficiency of the nitrogen that has been applied. So it's kind of
E-
maybe worth about 10 units, I think they say,
Exactly.
of the nitrogen. Yeah,
Yeah, especially on soils around here, like it's worth a lot.
very good. Just in relation to breeding, then, Padraig, I suppose we're kind of gone into the second half of the breeding season. What's the take on the ground in terms of how well it's gone?
Yeah, I'd say talking to farmers around Moorepark here anyway, breeding seems to be going fairly well in general. I suppose there's a lot of farmers now. We're kind of up to the 6, maybe 7 week mark of breeding at this stage on average. And I know some people are turning to now, look, bulls are going out. And I'm sure, I suppose it's important now to make sure you have enough bull power, sufficient bull power when the bulls do go out. And it could be a suggestion maybe as well when they go out for the first week or two, that you might um, keep eyeing for that week or two once the bulls have gone out. Um, and I suppose, look, it's time to start thinking about maybe when they're going to wrap up for the breeding season as well. The objective, at least, is to eliminate their May and June calvers. So when you look at it, if you're breeding on the 20th of July, that's a May calver. So the aim is to be finished at the latest by the 20th of July if you're wanting to try and eliminate any May calvers going forward. Because if you look at even looking at we're looking at the start of the year profit monitor meetings, and the cost to keep a cow is so high now that if you're any of those May June calvers, they're not going to leave much of a margin for the year.
Yeah, very good. And what about Youngstock? Any advice around management of the Youngstock?
Yeah, I suppose maybe for young stock, maybe the advice would just be to keep an eye on them, maybe weigh them to make sure they're on target, and if they aren't on target, maybe you might come in then or take some action then at that stage if it's shown that they're not on target.
Yeah, what about dosing there, maybe, Patrick, as well? Like, will people will be considering, I suppose, when we move into June, people will often be thinking of dosing stock like that. Would you have any advice around what people should be doing as to whether they should dose? You know, we're obviously trying to be conscious of anthelmintic resistance and so forth. So maybe the old story of just blanket dosing might be gone or is gone out the window. So how should people maybe approach whether they do or don't need to dose those young stock, because it will help them in terms of meeting the targets that you're talking about there to make sure that they are on the way targets, like.
Yeah, I suppose look sure I suppose looking at dosing, I suppose don't just do it routinely, maybe talk to your vet and then look at taking dung samples to see what the burden is on the farm. Um, some people then maybe take a dung sample after as well to see what weight it is at that stage. I suppose the advice would be just don't dose for the sake of dosing. Check if you need to dose or not.
Okay, very good. And then I suppose, Patrick, you were very, very busy I'm not saying that you're not busy now, of course, but up to a month ago, with BIS and derogation and so forth. Coming out of that period, we'll say, what kind of conversations were you having with farmers in relation to derogation and storage capacities and so forth? And are people thinking of doing work, or what way, or do they need to do work even from your experience?
Yeah, so look, in terms of slurry storage, there's been a nice bit of talk about there's been people talking about doing extra slurry storage. I suppose there's been a few things maybe that I suppose bottlenecks like that there's a few people unsure of new figures coming in, or there's people doesn't really know clarity on the planning exemption or whatever. But in general, there is people looking at increasing their slurry storage, or looking at seeing if they can make use of the grants that are there. There's a 60% grant now for some slurry storage investments. Um, and they're looking at planning for that, I suppose, going forward.
Okay, and in terms of, I suppose Patrick would have been on there recently with James as well, talking about investments for the year that is 2025. I suppose, look, no matter what way we look at it, it's going to be a solid financial year. From like a lot of milk is going to go in at a very good price. So have you been having many conversations in terms of investments other than the slurry storage? What are people looking at? Are they looking at trying to maybe save on labour and so forth, or what kind of equipment are people looking at maybe purchasing with the Thames options?
Yeah, I'd say, over the last few weeks, maybe people have been looking at kind of investments that making life easier, really. There's been, I suppose, around this area anyway, there's likes of your collars, um, heat selection collars and your automatic drafters have been getting very popular. And there's still people are still, look, that's the most popular one that have been gone in for Tams now over the last few weeks. Then you've other investments, like you say, making kind of um to help labour on farms. You're talking about slurry scrapers that have been put in and automatic calf feeders are still being put in. And then there's a lot of people looking at farm safety investments as well. They've been popular as well over the last few weeks. It's kind of in people investing and making life easier, really. Has been a lot of investments and planning going forward. And like if it's shaping up to be a good year, look, it's a good time to invest in some of these.
Very good. And then any final advice, I suppose, Patrick, for farmers that are little tuned into us in terms of the rest of the year? They've kind of given outlines in terms of what they should be doing for the grass currently. Obviously, trying to get the breeding finished up in a timely fashion so that there isn't a hangover in the spring of next year. But what should farmers be doing over the next number of weeks, in your opinion? I suppose around life in general, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose in general, look, I know there's a few groups at the moment planning trips around, going to other counties, maybe just plan across summer holidays, getting on holidays themselves, taking a few days off here and there. And I know we have the Moorepark Open Day coming up on the 2nd of July, so that's always a good day out as well. But yeah, once breeding is finished up and things like it's some groups are taking the opportunity now when it does finish up, or even now at the moment to get away and to go see different parts of the country.
What are they going to see then? Are they going to see farming, or are they going on tour?
A mix of both, I think. A mix of both. Yeah.
Very important, I presume.
Very important. Yeah, to get the social side and the farming side together.
Okay, Patrick. So thanks very much for coming on and giving us that update for this week.
Thanks, Stuart.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Age podcast, and my thanks to Padraig McCormack for joining me on this week's show. Just to remind people that the Moorepark Open Day will take place on Wednesday the 2nd of July 2025. This year's theme is Innovating for the Future. The event will start at 8:30 a.m. and all people are welcome. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. You can also email us on our dedicated Dairy Age email address, dairyage.podcast@teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join us next time for your Dairy Age.